By the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the communists were successful in taking over the whole country. The non-communists, however, fled to the island of Taiwan, after which the government on the mainland vowed to someday take control of the island and unify the country, whether by force or by peace. On the other side of the planet, however, and 73 years later, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops started lining up on the border with Ukraine. The plan was not complicated. The Kremlin had all the advantages imaginable. The Russian military was considered one of the strongest in the world, if not in history, with thousands of soldiers, tanks, guns, artillery, and whatever else was required for an invasion awaiting the Russian president's 5 a.m. call. This military had experience too. It had proved its strength and credibility in 2008 after successfully defeating Georgia in a conflict and supporting two separatist regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, this Russian military also preserved and kept afloat the government of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war, while at the same time fighting terrorist organizations throughout. The country in question this time, however, was much easier to invade and get involved in than were Georgia and Syria. Ukraine borders Russia on flat land, which means that there are few natural barriers such as mountains, jungles, or bodies of water between the two sides. This makes moving troops and equipment across the border fairly easily. Ukraine is also a very flat country, meaning that while it invades, the military likely wouldn't have to deal with difficult or harsh terrain. On the flip side of that, neither could the Ukrainian military use mountains or jungles to its advantage to hide and entrap the invaders, which is what the American and Soviet militaries had to deal with in Vietnam and Afghanistan, respectively. Yet here, that was not the case. Even if a good fight was put up by the Ukrainians, then the Russians had a large treasury from oil money they could use to fund the war themselves and deal with economic troubles. The problem, however, was that despite all these advantages, the invasion turned out to be a complete disaster. The smaller Ukrainian military prevented a quick Russian takeover due to several reasons, chief among them the surprising incompetence of Russia's military, in terms of how poor some of their equipment was, and their lackluster logistics. Nonetheless, this wouldn't mean as much were it not for the military and economic support from the United States and the rest of Europe to Ukraine. Many Eastern European countries, especially ones like Poland and the Baltics, have a long history of being invaded and occupied, especially by some form of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. And because of this, they sent supplies to the Ukrainians defending against the Russians. Because if Ukraine fell, then what's to say they won't be next? The Western European states, as well as the United States, also did not want to see the resurgence of a Russian empire, particularly one that could challenge the democratic foundation that they set up. The world, no, history's largest military force supported this flat and vulnerable country, and had a major multi-continental coalition of states that wanted to preserve their sovereignty. Now, what does this have to do with Taiwan? Well, in Southeast Asia, there is one thing that every country can agree on. They do not like China. Vietnam, not unlike Poland and the Baltics, has an odd history with its neighbor to the north, and does not like that China claims a large portion of Vietnamese maritime borders for itself. Across the sea, the Philippines also wants the same thing as Vietnam: respect for its maritime boundaries, which are being shrunk by Chinese assertiveness through the creation of artificial islands throughout the sea to legitimize the illegitimate claims. In the north, South Korea and Japan fear North Korean aggression, and its support from the Communist Party in Beijing is not a good look. These two have thousands of American troops stationed to protect them in a conflict. And then there's the biggest one, India, who doesn't like that Chinese investments throughout Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have totaled over $100 billion. This number gives the government in Beijing large-scale influence in India's neighborhood, which it could then use against India. Similar to the situation in Europe, the Americans have worked to bring together a coalition of these countries on the one thing that they can all agree on: a dislike of China. The United States has security agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, meaning that it has agreed to go to war in defense of these three states and has stated its willingness to back Taiwan. Its relationship with those who were once the Vietnamese communists has become even warmer and friendlier. And on top of this, it has helped to put together and create the Quad Alliance, comprised of it, Japan, India, and Australia, one of whose goals is to oppose Chinese influence and aggression in the region. The point is that China is surrounded from east to south, with many of its trade routes sitting in unfriendly territory. The militaries that it has angered are not tiny ones either, with many of them, like Vietnam, South Korea, and India, ranking as some of the largest armies in the world. If European and American military plus economic support, as well as overall logistical failures on behalf of the Russians, manage to prevent the quick takeover of Ukraine by the world's supposed second largest military, and instead made that military struggle to take down relatively weakly fortified defenders, then it is doubtful that a country with armed forces of similar size will be able to successfully invade the mountainous island that is Taiwan, whose invasion would have to cross 100 miles of water to invade mountains to take over a country who would likely be supported by every other country who does not want China to control them either.